welcome to Task National Competition Law course. And dear learner and viewer, as you can rightly recall that we have been discussing the extraterritorial application of competition law or transnational competition law in BRICS countries, and in that sequence today we are going to discuss about the competition laws in China in quick succession to our discussion relating to the Brazil, Russia and India. All these three countries we have covered, and today we will be discussing about the competition laws and policy in China to reflect upon the basic idea as to how the Chinese competition law happens to promote extraterritorial application, and as well as the Chinese competition law happens to be a case in point to understand as to how it can promote the transnational competition law. Dear learner and viewer, we have seen that the BRICS country primarily happens to be sharing a large land mass, large population, and as well as the market and the wealth. And among all the BRICS countries which we have studied so far, I think that the China happens to occupy a very prominent place simply because of the fact that the China is one of the most growing civilization and a continuous civilization, in the sense that the rise and fall of the civilization in China happens to be a constant phenomena. And in terms of its history, in terms of the political economy, in terms of its historical and political linearity, we see there happens to be a kind of a continuum of the political, social, cultural and economic continuity in the China across all the civilization. China happens to be one of the most prosperous countries of the world. Welcome to Transnational Competition Law course, and dear learner and viewer, we are going to discuss the competition laws in China. Dear learner and viewer, you can vividly recall our discussion about the extraterritorial application of competition law and transnational competition law in reference to the BRICS countries, and we have taken note of Brazil, we have taken note of Russia, we have taken note of India. Now we are going to take China and Chinese competition laws and policy from the standpoint of extraterritorial application of or transnational competition law, implication of the Chinese competition laws and policy. Dear learner and viewer, as you know that the China happens to be a very mighty country among all the BRICS country. We have seen that apart from the Russian federations and the Indian economy, the China happens to be a kind of a mammoth presence in the market, and the Chinese economy, history, society, polity happens to enjoy a continuous civilizational growth across all the annals and anecdotes of the history. That's why we find that in terms of the political linearity as well as in terms of the cultural continuity, the China happens to serve as a very leading example in the contemporary history. It has marked not only the economic decadence and political instability and military humiliation and the social regression and the deep degradation of the social fabric after the Mao Zedong's economic policy. However, we find that the Chinese economy happens to be a very resilient and very exuberant kind of the economy, which have come out of the impasse of all kind of the political instability, the military humiliation, the social regressions and the deep degradations and the social fabric's decadence. That's why we see the the Chinese competition law serves a kind of a model, a kind of a test case to examine as to how the China happens to be as one of the fastest growing economy and one of the most prosperous economy, and having its volume of trade across all the jurisdictions and having a transnational and global market. The share of the China happens to be very mammoth, very sizable, and that's why we see that the Chinese competition law is one of the basic reason to have such a biggest market size in the global market position which is enjoyed by the China. And therefore, what we see, dear learner and viewer, as we have seen in case of the Russian Federation, that the Chinese competition law is also called as anti-monopoly law. So this is one of the common thread between the Russian Federation and the China, that both try to prefer the word anti-monopoly law than that of what is called the antitrust law used by the United States and the competition law which is used by the European community, European Union, and the Indian competition law. Therefore, it becomes very important for us to understand as to what is the nature and concept of the anti-monopoly law in China. From this standpoint of view, what we will examine that the broad headings of the anti-monopoly law, which tries to prohibit monopolistic conduct in China, can be divided into number one, the anti-competitive agreement between the undertakings and abuse of dominance, and lastly, the merger that may have an effect of eliminating or restricting competition. Thus, we see that there are three major objectives of the anti-monopoly law of the China. In addition to that, we find there is an anti-monopoly law itself which implements the rules and guidelines, and it also assists in the application and interpretation of anti-monopoly law. The existing legislation relating to competition law or the anti-monopoly law well tries to encompass unfair competition law, the price law, the bidding law, contract law, and foreign trade law. From that point of view, we can see the competition law of China happens to be very elaborate and very exotic in that sense, that it's not only focusing what we have discussed just now, it's not only focusing the anti-competitive agreements, it's not only focusing the abuse of dominant position, it's not only focusing on the merger that have the effect of eliminating and restricting the competition, but it well transgress beyond that, and it tries to see that how anti-unfair competition law, how the price law, how the bidding law, how the contract law, how the foreign trade law have their direct nexus to the Chinese competition law or the Chinese monopoly law. With this, dear learner, we will try to understand as to what are the laws which has been passed in Chinese jurisdictions right from the beginning, and for that end we will first and foremost refer to the first legal document which manifests the very idea or manifestations of the competition law is the fact that Provisional Rules on the Development and Protection of Socialist Competition 1980 is the first kind of the document which tries to give the very preface of the competition law in China, and the Provisional Rules on the Development and Protection of the Socialist Competition in 1980 tries to have a maximum degree of the competition into the entire centralized planning system. Dear learner and viewer, it goes without saying, then when we believe in the socialist pattern of the society, there always happens to be a centralized planning system, and in the entire centralized planning system, what we find that the Republic of the China and happens to have this kind of the law which is called the Provisional Rules on the Development and Protection of the Socialist Competition, that gives a very socialistic perspective of the competition which was passed in 1980, and it tries to accommodate and afford a maximum degree of the competition. Vis-a-vis, it has the maximum degree of the sense of competitiveness, and the competition ecosystem has been built in the entire centralized planning of the People Republics of China through this law known as Provisional Rule on the Development and Protection of Socialist Competition in 1988. Dear learner, this happens to be the first law which deals with the anti-monopoly or the competition law. However, if you look at a cursory glance over the competition law on the China, first we find the provisional rules on the development and protection of socialist competition 1980. Second, we find law of People's Republic of China for countering unfair competition in 1993, and then per se or competition law per se or the anti-monopoly law per se, we find an anti-monopoly law of the People Republic of China 2008, and that gives a clear idea that the competition law in China happens to exist right from 1980. So that way we can say that the Chinese competition laws and policy have completed almost a half a century, 5 decades and more than 50 years of a development, which happens to be studied in detail, and thereby we will try to understand right from the 1980 law on the Provisional Rule and Development and Protection of the Socialist Competition and the law of People Republic of China for countering unfair competition 1993, we will try to understand some of the basic and salient features of the law of the People Republic of China for countering unfair competition, because that law technically tries to understand and engage itself into the entire issue of the competition laws and policy in 1993. Therefore, this law which came into force have 4 categories of the competitiveness and 4 kind of the objective, and the first objective happens to be the protection of the trademark and business secret. The second objective happens to be the regulation on false advertisement, and the third objective it happens to be that prohibition of anti-competition behavior, and lastly it has the regulation on public utility operators and the government. If we analyze some of the broad objectives of the law of People Republic of China for countering unfair competition 1993, what we find that the first 2 objectives relates to either intellectual property or the trade law or the trademark law, but the last 2 objectives directly hits hard to the prohibition of anti-competition behavior, and as well as is try to regulate the public utility operators and the government. Taken as a whole, the law of People Republics of China for countering unfair competition 1993 forbid setting of the predatory prices, it prohibits collusion in bidding, it tries to oppose administrative monopoly, and thus we see that the ambit and scope of the law of People Republics of China for countering unfair competition 1993 happens to address the major issues of restrictive agreement, major issues of abuse of dominant, major issues relating to all kind of anti-monopoly considerations and concerns, and then it tries to curb all kind of the competition concern, all kinds of monopolistic considerations, all kinds of oligopolistic tendencies, and it also tries to forbid predatory prices, it prohibits collusion in bidding, it tries to oppose administrative monopoly. So that way we see that the law of People Republics of China for countering unfair competition in 1993 happens to be a law which is to be seen with a great sense of pleasure, in the sense that despite it does not uses the word like anti-monopoly, it does not use the word competition, it does not use the word antitrust, but it tries to hit hard on the competition law and addresses the competition law in a very effective manner. Then the other laws, dear learner and viewer, happens to be the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republic of China 2008, and we can say that how the Chinese law right from the beginning of 1980 happens to subscribe any kind, the basic foundational value of the Chinese competition law happens to be anti-competitive agreement, happens to be abuse of dominance, happens to regulate the merger, happens to see that what are those kind of a conduct which have a tendency to eliminate or restrict the competition. And then we have seen the provisional rules of the development and protection of socialist competition 1980, and we have also perused what we can say about that the law of People's Republic of China for countering unfair competition 1993. Having understood these two laws and have appreciated their ambit and scope, we can just move in a technical sense that what is the express verbis recognition of the competition law, what is the express verbis recognition of the antitrust law, and what is the express verbis recognition of the anti-monopoly law in China, which is manifested by the anti-monopoly law of 2008, anti-monopoly law of the People's Republic of China 2008. And if we try to see some of the basic objectives and ethos of the law, anti-monopoly law of People's Republics of China, technically is the first legislation which came in 2008. We find that this law is dependent upon, this law rests on the three major pillars. The first pillar happens to be that this law tries to have is the merger control. The other pillar happens to be the prohibition of anti-competitive monopoly agreements, and the third pillar happens to be the prohibition of abuse of dominant market position. Thus we see that the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republics of China 2008 is a three-pillared approach kind of legislation which uses the word anti-monopoly, but it is the first competition law and the first antitrust law which tries to encompass the issues relating to the merger control, which tries to encompass the prohibition of anti-competitive monopoly, which tries to see that what are those agreements which have the tendency of having some kind of anti-competitive monopolistic system, and it tries to come very heavily on the abuse of dominant in the market position. So the law relating to anti-monopoly law of People's Republics of China 2008 happens to require the firm to take prior approval from the government before any transaction on concentration. So what is mandated by this law, that every firm has to mandatorily to go some kind of the process of consent, some kind of process of the approval and prior approval for any kind of a transaction which relates to the concentration. So there is a system of the clearance. And then the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republics of China 2008 also try to prohibit monopoly agreement between the companies competing business and the trading partners, which contains restrictions on competition. So while giving a kind of a blanket provision of mandating any kind of an approval or seeking consent or the clearances to understand the nature and the magnitude of the transactions on the concentration, the anti-monopoly law of China 2008 comes very heavily to all those kinds of the collusive agreements between the firms, between the parties, between the companies, between the business conglomerates, and then it tries to see that how these tendencies are going to impact on the market and try to restrict the competition. Although this law the anti-monopoly law of People's Republic of China 2008 have made certain exceptions, and the range of the exceptions has been extended to relating to the restriction to improvement of technology. So there are certain exceptions. The general rule is that it has to seek some kind of a prior approval and the consent regarding the agreement, but there are certain areas where this anti-monopoly law of People's Republic of China 2008 tries to confer some kind of the exception, and the first exception happens to be that restriction on the improvement of technology. It does not apply to that. Then the second exception happens to be if it comes to the improvement of product quality and the product efficiency, it does not apply. Then the third exception is that if it is going to enhance the competitiveness of small, medium-sized companies to protect their economic downturns, then this law is not going to be applied. And fourthly, that if it is going to have to protect some kind of a legitimate interest relating to foreign trade and the economic cooperation, then again this law is not going to be applied. And lastly, this law have created an exception to achieve some social public interest in relation to or in the sphere of or in the arena of the energy conservation and as well as the environment protection and as well as the sustainable development. So then taken as a whole, what we have seen that the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republic of China, which is said to be technically the first law on the competition in China, happens to see some of the very progressive sounding provisions besides its primary focus on the merger control and prohibition of anti-competitive monopolies and prohibition of abuse of dominance and making all the firms subservient to seek some kind of the clearance, the approval, the consent from the competition authorities. It tries to also leverage some of the sectors from its purview, and those sectors happens to be definitely the improvement of technology, the product quality, the product efficiencies, and enhancement of competition to protect the small and the medium companies, and as well as to protect the legitimate interest in any kind of the foreign trade and the economic cooperation vis-a-vis that it accords some exceptions to the social and public interest in matters of energy conservation and the environment protection. So that way, dear learner and viewer, what we discussed today is the case of the competition law and policy in China, and in that reference we have seen the entire historical anecdote of the Chinese economy and society, and then we try to see that the anti-monopolies law's foundational value in China happens to be a threefold kind of the objective, which relates to the anti-competitive agreement, abuse of dominant position and control of the merger. And then we have tried to reflect upon the first and the foremost law on the provisional rules on the development and protection of socialist competition 1980. We have taken note of the laws of People's Republic of China for countering unfair competition 1993, and then we analyzed and prefaced some of the basic features of the anti-monopoly law of People's Republic of China 2008, and we have seen its ambit and scope and as well as the proviso and the exceptions. Dear learner, I hope the discussion on the Chinese competition law as a backgrounder will serve and deepen our understanding about the extraterritorial application of competition law vis-a-vis the transnational application of competition law in a better manner. And then with this, I hope and conclude and wish happy learning to you.